was supposed to be a quiet Sunday dinner, just like the dozens that came before, simple, predictable, with roast chicken and potatoes and a side of silence that we'd grown used to. I'd settled into the habit of these dinners, knowing the routine. Delilah would sip her wine with that tight-lipped smile, Sierra would scroll on her phone between bites, and I'd pretend everything was fine. But tonight felt different, like the air itself carried a static charge that threatened to ignite. Delilah sat across from me in the same chair she'd claimed for years, her posture too perfect, her eyes too sharp. Sierra, 17 and already armed with her mother's disdain, twirled a strand of hair and eyed me like I was the punchline to a joke. I tried to focus on the food, on the way the chicken's skin glistened under the overhead light, on the potatoes that smelled like butter and rosemary, but my appetite faded fast. Delilah set her wine glass down with a small, deliberate click, the sound somehow louder than the old clock ticking in the background. She cleared her throat, that practiced way she had when she was about to drop a verdict she'd been rehearsing all day. "We're cutting you off completely," she said, her voice flat but her eyes alive with a cold certainty, like a guillotine's blade coming down. No anger, just finality. I didn't flinch. I didn't even breathe. I watched her lips, that perfect line of lipstick she always wore when she wanted to feel powerful. Sierra didn't even look at her mother for permission, didn't hesitate. "You're poor, lazy, and not a good father," she said, her tone as casual as if she'd ordered a coffee. She didn't blink. She didn't fidget. She'd been waiting for this moment, ready to brand me with labels that stuck like tar. I felt the room shrink then, the table suddenly too small for all the unspoken words crammed between us. I looked at them. My wife and my daughter, sitting like they'd been cast from the same mold, both wearing that same expression that said, "We've decided what you are, and that's the end of it." I thought about the days I'd worked double shifts to keep food on this table, about the nights I'd come home smelling like oil and sweat, my hands cracked from labor, just to see them asleep with the lights left on. I thought about the time I'd taught Sierra to ride her bike in this very driveway, running alongside her with her laughter echoing through the neighborhood, like I was the best father in the world. But none of that mattered now. They'd made up their minds, sealed the file, and passed judgment. I could have stood up, slammed my hands on the table, demanded they remember, but what was the point? Words had no place here. Not now. Then, as if on cue, my phone buzzed on the table. It wasn't loud, but it sliced through the tension like a blade. I reached for it, my fingers trembling just slightly, a reflex born from too many late-night work calls that always carry bad news. But this wasn't that. "Mr. Biden," the voice on the other end said, crisp, professional, but tinged with something I hadn't heard before, excitement. "Your company's stock just hit $100 million. I blinked, staring at the phone as if it had grown wings. My mind raced through the math, the milestones, the blood and sweat I'd poured into Triarch Systems, the nights I'd sat up coding while Delilah slept. 100 million. My chest tightened, my breath caught, and I almost laughed, not out of humor, but out of something deeper, something that felt like a rope snapping free from my chest. I looked up at them. Delilah's fork hovered midair, her eyes wide, her face frozen in that perfect mask of composure cracking under the weight of something she couldn't control. Sierra's hand stopped mid-scroll, her eyes blinking like she'd just woken from a dream. The room fell silent. I didn't need to say a word, but I did. I lifted my eyes slowly, let them rest on Delilah first, then on Sierra. I saw the confusion swirling in their eyes, the sudden realization that the man they'd written off as poor, lazy, and worthless had just become something else, something they didn't know how to handle. "Excuse me," I said softly, my voice steady, every syllable deliberate. "You were saying something?" It was like the table itself shuddered. Delilah's lips parted, but no words came out. Sierra's face lost its practiced smirk. I let the silence hang there, like a weight they'd have to carry themselves. I felt something shift inside me, something uncoiling, like I'd been holding my breath for too many years and finally remembered how to let it out. I wanted to stand up and walk out, but I didn't. I wanted them to sit there in the space they'd created, to feel every second of their own silence. I wanted them to understand what they'd done and what they'd lost. So I just sat there, watching them, the man they thought they could cut off, the man they thought they could belittle into submission. My phone screen still glowed, the numbers dancing like a promise I'd kept to myself. 100 million. It was supposed to be a quiet Sunday dinner, but it turned out to be the night everything changed. The night I realized that the approval I'd been chasing for so long had always been conditional, that their love had strings attached to my income, my success, my failures. And in that moment, I didn't feel poor or lazy or worthless. I felt free. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. I didn't know what they'd say next, or how they'd spin their story. But I knew one thing. I wasn't the man they thought I was. And I never would be again. They didn't always see me this way. I guess that's what hurt most, that once, there was respect in their eyes, even a hint of admiration that carried me through those endless nights. Back then, I was the man who worked 16-hour shifts as a night maintenance lead while building my software prototype in the small hours before dawn. My uniform was oil-stained, my boots scuffed, but I came home with a paycheck that paid the bills, bought new shoes for Sierra, and kept Delilah's wine rack full. She bragged about me then. My husband's so driven, she'd say to her friends over coffee or in the PDA line. Her tone a mix of pride and something else, a claim to status she wore like jewelry. Sierra used to beam when I'd walk in after a long shift, my hands black with grease. She'd tug at my pant leg and ask, "Daddy, did you fix something today?" I'd scoop her up and say, "I always fix things, baby girl." But that was before Triarch was even a name on my battered laptop. Before the steady paychecks gave way to an uncertain future I couldn't guarantee. It happened in increments, the respect draining out of their eyes like water from a cracked glass. At first, Delilah was patient. She'd leave the light on for me when I came home late, ask about my progress with the prototype. I'd talk about infrastructure software, data routing, the ways I could make hospital systems safer and more efficient. She'd smile, but it never reached her eyes. It was the smile you give to a child showing you a rock they found in the yard, polite, patronizing. Then the bonuses stopped coming. I'd cashed out my 401k, sold my truck, my baby, the one I'd worked overtime to buy, and handed over the keys like I was selling a piece of myself. I poured every cent into Triarch's first iteration, every sleepless night into the code that would one day build a bridge between hospitals and patients. But money was slow to return, slower than I'd hoped. I'd come home to bills stacked like accusations on the kitchen counter. Delilah's lips would press together so tight the color drained from them. "We need stability," she'd say, her voice low but edged with something hard. "Sierra needs a future." I'd try to explain the contracts I was chasing, the pilots I was testing. I'd tell her about the meeting I had with Northridge Medical, how close we were to getting them on board. She'd nod, but the nod felt empty, like she'd already decided I was failing before I even got a chance to prove myself. Sierra was worse. At 17, she'd learned the art of judgment from her mother, perfected it like a craft. "Why can't you be like mom's friends' husbands?" she'd ask, her tone biting. I knew those men, real estate agents, mid-level managers at accounting firms, guys with ties and smiles who'd never missed a paycheck. They played golf on Saturdays and posted family selfies on Instagram with captions like "blessed beyond measure." They'd never risked everything for a dream. They'd never built something from scratch and carried its weight on their back through every setback, every doubt. Because they weren't building what I was. They weren't the ones scouring second-hand laptops at 3 in the morning to find one that didn't overheat. They didn't spend hours on public library Wi-Fi because the home internet had been cut off that month. They didn't skip meals to buy server space or walk to meetings because their car payment had gone to pay a developer's salary instead. I was doing that. Me. And every sacrifice I made felt like a deposit in a future they'd benefit from: Sierra's tuition, Delilah's dinners with friends, the house that kept its lights on because I refused to let them dim. But they didn't see that anymore. They saw only the man who'd fallen from grace, who'd traded his steady paychecks and oil-stained coveralls for code and risk. To them, I was the one who'd let go of their comfort and forced them into a limbo they couldn't name but felt in every unpaid bill, every canceled vacation, every no at the mall. I'd catch Delilah's glances sometimes when we passed the bank. The way her eyes lingered on the families in line, the men with pressed shirts and thick wallets. She'd squeeze her purse like she was holding something fragile, something that might shatter if she let it go. I'd try to reach for her hand, but she'd pull away, pretending to adjust her bag or her phone. Sierra would watch us both with that cold, practiced gaze. I knew she parroted her mother's judgment like it was gospel. Delilah had made it easy for her. "Your dad's being irresponsible. Your dad's chasing a dream that's costing us everything. Your dad can't even take us out for dinner without worrying about the bill." Sierra absorbed those words like ink and water, staining her view of me until there wasn't a drop of the old trust left. I'd sit at my desk at night, staring at the lines of code that looked like salvation and damnation all at once. I'd remember Sierra's laughter, the way she'd used to run into my arms like I was her hero. I'd remember the nights Delilah brought me a beer while I worked, her eyes warm, her touch soft. Those nights were gone now, replaced by silence that wrapped around the house like a shroud. Still, I kept going. I didn't quit. I didn't curse them, though God knows I wanted to some days. I just kept typing, kept building, kept believing in something no one else could see. Because I knew, deep down, that if I could just get Triarch off the ground, if I could just prove to them and to myself that this dream was more than a gamble, maybe, just maybe, they'd look at me the way they used to. But that was the lie I told myself. The truth was simpler, and it hit me hardest on the nights when the code blurred and the exhaustion pressed down like lead. Respect isn't given for effort. It's given for results. And the longer I chased my dream, the more I realized. No one, especially not the ones you love, will believe in it until it's already too late to doubt. I just had to hope I'd still want their respect when that time finally came. Nobody saw the grind. That's the part that still gnawed at me, the way they all expected to reap the rewards but had no clue what it took to get there. Every night, the glow of my laptop screen was my only company. The rest of the house slept, quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional groan of the old pipes. My back ached from the hours hunched over the keyboard, the code on the screen blurring into lines that danced with fatigue. But I kept going, because every line I wrote, every bug I fixed at 3 a.m., was a step closer to the life I'd promised myself, the life I'd promised them, even if they couldn't see it. The public library became my second home. Our internet was shut off more times than I cared to admit, and the library's Wi-Fi felt like a lifeline to the world outside. I'd sit there, surrounded by textbooks and hushed conversations, the smell of old carpet and paper mingling with the taste of instant coffee from the vending machine. I'd lean forward, eyes locked on the screen, willing the software to work, to hold together the pieces I'd built from scratch. Triarch Systems. The name itself felt like a prayer, a promise of stability for hospitals, for patients who needed schedules to run on time and data to stay safe. I knew the world didn't see the value in infrastructure software, but I did. I saw the administrators trying to juggle chaos with spreadsheets and whiteboards, the nurses running from ward to ward, never knowing who needed what or when. I wanted to fix that. I wanted to make their world a little easier, even if it meant making mine harder. Delilah never asked about the details anymore. She'd stopped caring after the first few months, after she realized that there were no big checks coming home, no fancy dinners, no shopping sprees. She'd given up on the idea that my dream might one day be more than a drain on her patients. Sierra followed suit. At first, she'd ask, "How's the company, Dad?" But her tone turned brittle over time, the way a leaf curls under too much sun. Eventually, she stopped asking altogether. I let them. Not out of fear, not because I thought they were right, but because I had work to do. Every second I spent trying to convince them was a second stolen from the grind that would one day prove them wrong. I remember the first time I landed a contract. Northridge Medical. I'd walked into that meeting wearing the one decent suit I owned, gray, a little too tight at the shoulders, but passable. The conference room smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee. The hospital's CFO sat across from me with a skeptical eye, flipping through my proposal like it was a menu he hadn't decided on. I pitched them on efficiency, on reducing wait times, on cutting costs in ways that wouldn't gut patient care. I talked about real-time scheduling and secure data routing. I showed him the prototype, even though I knew it was rough, even though I knew every time I clicked something there was a chance it might crash. It didn't. It ran. And for a moment, I saw it, the flicker of belief in his eyes. He signed on for a pilot program. I walked out of that hospital with a contract in hand, my heart pounding like a drumbeat. I wanted to call Delilah, wanted to tell her I'd done it, that all those nights she'd called me irresponsible had led to this. But I didn't. I went home, put the contract on my desk, and opened my laptop. Because one deal wasn't enough. One deal didn't pay off the house or fix the broken trust. I needed more. I needed momentum. 2 more hospitals signed on in the next 6 months. The revenue was slow at first, smaller deals, cautious steps. But I saw the pattern, the way word of mouth spread among administrators who were desperate for any solution that worked. My phone started ringing. My email inbox, once a wasteland of rejection and spam, filled with inquiries. But I kept quiet. I didn't boast about the wins. I didn't come home with balloons or pop champagne in the living room. Part of me thought I should have. Part of me wondered if maybe that was what they'd been waiting for, some grand gesture that proved I wasn't just a man playing with a toy. But that wasn't me. I'd sit at the dinner table, listening to Delilah complain about the price of groceries, about the way her friends' husbands could take them on vacations without worrying about the bills. Sierra would chime in about homecoming dresses and the latest phone models she wanted, like the whole world revolved around the labels she wore. I'd listen, nod, say, "We'll see," and then go back to work. Because every hour I spent grinding was another hour closer to the future I was building. Sometimes, when the house was dark and I'd closed the last bug report for the night, I'd lean back in my chair and stare at the ceiling. The silence felt heavy, but also honest. In that space, there was no judgment, no sideways glances, no sighs that carried 1,000 unspoken criticisms. There was just me and the work, the grind. I started to understand something that changed the way I looked at everything. Respect isn't given for the hours you work in secret. It's given for the results that can't be ignored. I could build the best system in the world, but until I showed them the money, the contracts, the headlines, they'd never see it. That realization hurt, but it also hardened me. So I let them ignore me. I let them believe I was a failure. I let them talk to their friends about how I'd let them down, because I knew what they didn't. I knew that the foundation was already in place, that the calls were coming, that the grind was paying off in ways they'd never imagined. And when the day came that my phone buzzed with that one call, the call that would change everything, I'd be ready. But until then, I'd keep my head down, keep the code flowing, keep the contracts coming. Because one day they'd look at me and see what I'd known all along, that success isn't built in the spotlight. It's built in the grind, in the silent nights, in the hours nobody else sees. Back to dinner. I couldn't get the taste of that chicken out of my mouth, and not because it was good, because it was seasoned with the salt of resentment. The room seemed smaller now, like the walls were leaning in, pressing me down. Delilah and Sierra sat across from me, side by side, a united front of judgment that used to be my family. Their eyes gleamed with that same cold light I'd seen too many times before, except tonight it felt final, like the executioner's sword was poised above my head. Delilah leaned back in her chair, arms crossed like she was closing off any last path I might have had to her grace. "We can't keep pretending you're an equal," she said. Her voice was sharp, measured, every word placed with the precision of a scalpel. I watched her lips move, the way her wine glass left a ring on the polished wood table. It used to be my table, our table, back when we built it together on a Saturday morning with leftover lumber and too many laughs to count. Now it felt like a stage, and I was the only one who didn't know my lines. "You don't even bring in real money," she continued, like she was reading a script she'd memorized weeks ago. Sierra, eager as always to impress her mother, piled on without hesitation. "Mom does everything. You just sit there." Her words hit like darts, aimed at all the places I'd built up my armor, but never quite sealed. I sat there, staring at the two of them, feeling the gap between us stretch into a canyon I wasn't sure I could cross. That's when my phone rang. Deidre's name lit up the screen, and I almost didn't answer. Maybe some part of me wanted to keep the victory to myself, to savor it alone before the world tried to pry it from my hands. But instinct took over, and I swiped the screen with a thumb that trembled just a little. "Hey, Deidre," I said, my voice calm. On the other end, her tone was crisp, bright, the kind of tone that didn't waste time. "Mr. Biden, congratulations," she said, and in that instant, the room froze. Triarch just hit a $100 million valuation. The news is live. Wall Street Journal just posted. I sat in my home office late at night, the glow of the monitor washing over my face as I studied the pension scheme I'd helped draft. Brielle's name was right there, in bold letters, nestled among dozens of others. When she left her teaching job to chase her wellness app, I'd slipped her into the Hartwell Extended Benefits Plan under spousal courtesy. She'd called it sweet at the time, a sign that I was finally acting like a provider. But it wasn't charity. It was insurance. She'd never bothered to read the fine print, the line that gave me discretion to restructure terms as the controlling signatory. She'd never asked what I was really doing every night in this room, poring over spreadsheets and pension ledgers like they were holy texts. The pension system was a living, breathing thing, a tangled mass of dependencies and clauses that could make or break a person if you knew where to look. And I knew exactly where to look. Every late night at the office, every coffee run to the accounting team, every innocent question I'd asked Monroe about the pension plan, they all added up. I'd built a blueprint in my mind, each detail a weapon she'd never see coming. That was my real job, the one she couldn't grasp, building a fortress of knowledge, one clause at a time. I remembered the day she'd told her mother about leaving teaching. "He's such a good man," she'd said, smiling like I was a child who'd just tied his own shoes. "He set me up with benefits so I could chase my dreams. That's what a supportive husband does." Her mother had smirked, the same way Brielle did when she thought she was winning. Well, let's hope his support holds up. I'd sat at the table that night, nodding like the devoted husband, letting them think I was grateful to be part of their show. But inside, I'd already seen the plan, every deposit, every withdrawal, every clause that governed early payouts. I drafted some of them myself, long before she ever thought to ask. She didn't understand how these things worked. She saw the pension as a safety net, a backup plan in case her wellness app didn't take off. But I saw it as leverage. I saw it as the lock she'd chained herself to without realizing I held the key. I'd written the clause myself, one line tucked in among 100 others. Early withdrawal subject to discretionary adjustment at the discretion of the plan administrator. She'd never questioned who that administrator was. She'd assumed it was the same corporate suit who'd signed off on the rest of the paperwork. But it wasn't. It was me. The secretary she'd told everyone was too small to matter. I remembered the night she mentioned wanting to cash out some of her pension just in case. She'd smiled sweetly, as if asking for a favor. "It's just a little something for my business," she'd said, stirring her tea with that air of innocence she wore like perfume. I'd nodded, playing the part. "Of course, Brielle," I'd said, my voice steady. "Whatever you need." She'd kissed my cheek like I was a child. "You're the best, Silas. You really are." I'd watched her walk out of the room, and I'd thought, I really am. Because every night in this office, every hour I'd spent dissecting those clauses, every whispered conversation with the plan's lawyer, they'd all led to this moment. The moment where she'd think she was stepping into her future, only to realize she was stepping into a bear trap. When I filed the paperwork for her early withdrawal, I followed every regulation to the letter. I sent her the forms. She signed them, smiling that same smile she used when she thought she'd won. She didn't even read the new terms I'd attached, the ones that detailed her tax liabilities, the ones that cited the discretionary clause that gave me the final say. She didn't ask why the payout was lower than she'd expected. She just saw the numbers and assumed she was in control. She never once asked why her sweet husband was so eager to help her cash out. Because to Brielle, I was still the man who answered phones and fetched coffee, the man who gave her pension benefits like a dog offering a bone. The day the payment hit her account, she texted me a heart emoji. "Thanks for being so supportive," she wrote. I stared at the screen, feeling the irony settle like a stone in my gut. Supportive. She'd never know that I'd structured the withdrawal to trigger an automatic tax penalty, one that would freeze her business account until she paid up. And she'd never understand that by the time she called her lawyer, the pension plan would have been rolled into my private trust, sealed behind layers of corporate policy she'd never unravel. That's the thing about ambition. It doesn't always show its teeth. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it's the man behind the desk, the one who nods and says, "Of course, whatever you need." I thought about her words. "You're not ambitious, Silas. You're just safe." I thought about the night she'd come home from those Red Oaks dinner parties, telling me about all the men who'd tried to hit on her, how she'd laughed them off. "You're my safe place," she'd say. But I wasn't her safe place. I was her exit plan. And I turned that exit plan into a lockbox she couldn't pick. The night I finalized the last clause, I poured myself a whiskey and stared at the screen, watching the cursor blink like a heartbeat. I thought about all the times she'd looked at me with that practiced patience, like I was a project she'd one day outgrow. I thought about the smirk that spread across her face when she talked about her starter husband. And I thought about the spa club, the look on her face when Monroe told her the truth, the glass dropping from her hand, the silence that followed. That was the moment she realized the game had changed. But this was the moment she'd realized the price of underestimating me. I hit submit. The pension plan shifted, the forms processed. Her early withdrawal triggered, complete with the tax implications she'd never seen coming. And I sat there, breathing in the silence, feeling the weight of every late night, every whispered conversation, every piece of the puzzle I'd laid down so carefully. She'd never see it coming. She'd blame the system. She'd blame. 2 weeks after the spa club revelation, the world outside our home seemed to move on. But inside the house, the air was thick with something unspoken. Brielle and I moved around each other like strangers who'd been left in the same waiting room. She'd come home from work, her eyes hard, her phone always in her hand, and I'd pretend to be working on the company's latest quarterly report. We'd have dinner in silence. She'd push the rice around on her plate, feign a smile, and then disappear upstairs to one of her endless FaceTime calls with Royce or the lawyers she thought I didn't know about. I knew. I always knew. The day she served me divorce papers was a Friday. She picked Fridays for everything important: job interviews, spa days, manipulations. Fridays felt fresh, like a new chapter was starting, and she liked to feel like she was writing the story. I heard the car in the driveway before I heard the door open. I was in the study, reviewing the merger documents for the spa chain I'd just folded under Carter and Leighton Capital. My kingdom was expanding. And yet, my hands paused when I heard the front door. There was something about her footsteps that felt rehearsed, like she'd practiced this moment in front of the mirror. She came into the study holding a manila envelope like it was a peace offering, but the smile on her face was the same one she used on waiters she didn't plan to tip. "Silas," she said, voice sugar-sweet. "I think we both know this has been a long time coming." She set the envelope on the desk, sliding it across the polished oak like she was dealing cards. I didn't flinch. I'd seen enough backroom deals to know when a bluff was coming. She watched me, her eyes cold, daring me to react. "I'm filing for divorce," she said, savoring each word like it was a victory. "It's for the best. We've outgrown each other. I'm finally making a smart move." I picked up the envelope, turning it over in my hands as if it might bite. Inside, I already knew, were the documents she'd spent weeks preparing, meticulously arranged by Royce's lawyer friend, I imagined. She expected me to panic, to argue, to beg for another chance. But I didn't. I didn't even raise an eyebrow. Instead, I opened my desk drawer and pulled out my own envelope, thicker, heavier, each page a nail in the coffin of the life she thought she was building. I slid it across to her, watching the confidence drain from her face like wine spilling from a broken glass. "What's this?" she asked, her voice a notch higher, eyes darting from the envelope to me like I'd flipped the table in the middle of her game. I didn't answer right away. I wanted the silence to press against her, to remind her that she'd underestimated the man behind the desk for too long. "Proof," I said finally, my voice even. "Proof of marital fraud, pension misuse, unauthorized access to company systems." Her hands trembled as she flipped through the pages, the lines of legal text swimming in front of her eyes. "Sweetheart," I added, letting the words sink in like a blade. "This house, your pension, your app, none of it was ever yours alone." She tried to speak, her lips parting, but no words came out. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. "Silas," she whispered, her voice cracking. What is this?" I leaned back in my chair, watching her. "It's the truth," I said. "The truth you never bothered to look for while you were busy playing queen of the starter husbands. Every dollar you moved, every account you dipped into, that's all documented. Every time you used my company's resources to prop up your little wellness app, every time you siphoned funds under the table with Royce's help, it's all here." I tapped the envelope with one finger. "Your signature is on every page." Her eyes darted around the room like she was searching for an escape. "You can't do this," she stammered. You can't just take everything away." I let a small smile creep onto my face, the kind that says I've already won. "I'm not taking everything," I said calmly. "I'm taking what was always mine. You wanted to cash out your pension? You got it, minus the tax penalties you didn't read about. You wanted to launch that app? You did, using my company's money. You wanted to move on? Here's your chance. But don't expect to take the house I built, or the car you drive, or the accounts you thought you were so clever hiding." I let the words hang there, heavy and sharp, because I own it all now. She collapsed into the chair across from me, the divorce papers still clutched in her hand like a lifeline. Her voice was a whisper, shaky and small. "Why?" she asked, tears welling in her eyes. "Why would you do this to me?" I leaned forward, elbows on the desk, and for the first time in years, I let the cold calculation slip into my voice. "Because every time you called me your starter husband," I said, "you reminded me that you never saw me as more than a stepping stone. Every time you laughed at my ambition, you gave me one more reason to prove you wrong. I gave you everything, Brielle, and you spat on it. So now, I'm giving you exactly what you deserve, a clean break, with none of the benefits you thought you'd get for free." She covered her face with her hands, sobbing now, the tears smudging the makeup she'd applied so carefully that morning. I felt no pity. I felt nothing but the satisfaction of a plan executed to perfection. She'd thought she was making a smart move, but she'd never read the fine print, never considered that the man behind the desk was the one holding the real power. I stood up, straightening my tie, the gesture as final as a closing argument. "You wanted a divorce," I said, my voice flat. "You've got it. But don't expect me to be the man you can run back to when it all falls apart. Because from now on, Brielle, you're on your own." She looked up, her eyes red and puffy, and I saw the realization dawn. She'd lost. She gambled on my silence, on my patience, on my willingness to be the man who always said yes. But I wasn't that man anymore. I walked around the desk, the papers still between us like a battlefield littered with casualties. I opened the door and gestured toward the hall. "You can leave now," I said. "The driver's waiting." She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. And then she stood, gathering the papers in trembling hands, and walked out of the study without another word. I waited until I heard the front door click shut before I let out the breath I'd been holding. The silence felt different now. Not heavy, but clean, like the air after a storm. I sat back down, picked up the pen she'd left on the desk, and started signing the final documents. Because this was no longer about her. This was about me. About the man she'd never bothered to see. The man who'd been studying, planning, building his fortress while she was busy mocking his ambition. The man who'd finally taken control. The man who was no one's starter husband. The first time I opened my ledger, it wasn't even a ledger yet. Just a cheap spiral-bound notebook from the office supply store, the kind they handed out like cheap apologies at the reception desk. I tucked it into the bottom drawer of my desk, hidden beneath a stack of outdated invoices that no one ever bothered to check. I'd sit there at lunch breaks and after hours, the quiet hum of the building filling the silence, and I'd write. Not in neat lines or bullet points, just names, dates, and details. Small slights, offhand insults, every time someone called me secretary with that sneer in their voice. Every time someone laughed when I walked into the break room. Every time Brielle's voice dripped with that condescending sweetness. "Oh, Silas, you're so sweet. So safe." Hazel Tran was the one who taught me the real value of a ledger. She was the senior HR rep who everyone thought was too old to be relevant. But she was sharper than any of them. She'd spent decades navigating corporate politics, collecting secrets like pearls. She once caught me scribbling in that notebook at my desk after hours. She paused, her eyes crinkled with a knowing smile. "Invisible men hold more power than loud ones," she said. "Use that." She tapped the notebook with one painted fingernail. "Write it all down. You'd be surprised how the small things add up." I never forgot that. Hazel retired 2 years later, but her words stayed. Every time I opened that ledger, I could still hear her voice. Invisible men hold more power. By the time Brielle started bragging about my lack of ambition at her family dinners, the ledger was no longer a cheap spiral-bound notebook. It was a file on my encrypted drive, backed up to a server no one knew about. It was a map of every relationship in that office, every conversation that hinted at opportunity or risk. When Monroe forgot to CC me on a confidential email, I noted it. When Nora Winslow from Operations let slip that Monroe was grooming a nephew for a management role, I filed that away too. Every detail mattered. Like a spider in its web, I sat there, silent and patient, waiting for the right vibrations. Brielle never asked what I was doing when I stayed late. She thought I was a coward, too timid to ask for a raise or a promotion. If you just spoke up once in a while, she'd say, glass of wine in hand, maybe people would respect you. But I didn't need their respect. I needed their complacency. I needed them to keep underestimating me. Because while they laughed, I built a fortress of information. I traced every department's vulnerabilities, every expense report that didn't add up, every HR complaint that vanished into thin air. I documented it all. Not to use it right away. No, I was more patient than that. Like a gardener, I let those details grow, intertwine, until I had a network strong enough to support an empire. The night I moved from receptionist to operations analyst, it was because I knew every weakness in the system. I'd found a pension discrepancy that no one else had noticed, money leaking from the accounts like a slow bleed. I brought it to Monroe, my tone deferential. "Just thought you'd like to know, sir." He blinked, surprised, but that surprise quickly turned to opportunity. "Good eye, Carter," he'd said. "Let's see what else you can find." That's how it always started. One small detail, one invisible thread that led to a web they didn't even know they were caught in. From operations analyst to silent partner, the journey was all in the ledger. I tracked every promotion, every termination. Every time someone in HR slipped and sent me a file I wasn't supposed to see, I read it carefully. Every time someone cracked a joke at my expense in the break room, I logged the name and date. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted to understand the shape of their power. Hazel had taught me that revenge is petty, but knowledge is forever. And the best revenge is making sure they can't touch you. When Brielle's app started taking off, thanks to the marketing contacts she'd made through my company, I didn't stop her. I let her think she was clever, let her think she was building something on her own. But every developer she hired, every ad she placed, every dollar she transferred came through systems I controlled. I'd sit at my desk and watch the transactions ping across my screen. She didn't know the terms she'd agreed to when she signed the corporate partnership agreement, didn't know that every click and every invoice was routed through Carter and Leighton servers. She thought she was the CEO of her own little empire. I knew she was a line item in my ledger. When the day came that I bought out Monroe, structured in a leveraged buyout that started with staplers and ended with boardroom votes, I didn't need applause. I didn't want confetti. I wanted the quiet satisfaction of watching every man who'd laughed at me stare as I signed the documents. I wanted the ledger to show its final entry, Silas Carter, CEO. And when the board voted, it was unanimous. Because every man who'd ever underestimated me was on that ledger, every vote a line I'd written down years ago. I knew their fears, their debts, their ambitions. I knew when to smile and when to twist the knife. Brielle didn't come to the vote. She was too busy planning her next big move, too busy telling her friends how she'd outgrown me. She'd never even asked how I'd gotten there, never thought to look beyond the title of secretary. But I didn't need her approval. I'd outgrown her too, in my own way. And the ledger? It was more than a list of insults. It was my story, every silent triumph, every hidden victory. Every time someone tried to bury me, I grew roots in the dark, until I was too deep to cut down. Hazel once told me, use the ledger to remember where you came from. Because power's a funny thing, it makes people forget. I never forgot. Even now, with the CEO badge clipped to my shirt and the company name on my business card, I still open that file at night. I still read the entries. Not out of spite, but as a reminder that every empire starts in the dirt. Every king was once the man behind the desk. Every success I built was forged in the silence of their laughter. So let them laugh. Let them call me the secretary. Let them underestimate me. Because every time they do, they give me another line to write in my ledger. And every line makes me stronger. Controlling a company doesn't always start with a boardroom. Sometimes it starts with a paperclip. I learned that in the quiet corners of Monroe's office, where I'd stand with my clipboard, half listening as he outlined his plans to the board or the shareholders or the latest investor he was trying to impress. My job, at least on paper, was to support him, keep his calendar, book his flights, brew his coffee. But my real job, the one no one saw, was to learn. Every time I straightened a stack of documents or replaced a spent staple, I was learning. Who Monroe trusted, who he dismissed, who in the boardroom carried more power than their title suggested. The way the CFO's voice shook when discussing quarterly reports. The way Nora Winslow's brow furrowed every time Monroe brought up expansion plans. I watched it all, cataloged it, stored it away in the ledger in my head. A paperclip. It seems like nothing, a piece of bent metal meant to hold papers together. But in my hands, it became a tool of power. I used it to pin together the pension documents that exposed a leak in the company's funds. I used it to hold together contracts that showed Monroe's nephew, the one he'd been grooming for management, had been skimming funds from a side contract. I'd clip the documents and carry them into Monroe's office, and he'd glance at them, half interested, then sign. He trusted me because he thought I was small, thought I was loyal, thought I'd never dream of using a paperclip to build my empire. Nora Winslow was the first to see me differently. She was sharp, the kind of woman who noticed the details everyone else missed. The day I walked into her office with a stack of reports she hadn't authorized, she raised an eyebrow. "Silas," she said, her voice like a scalpel, "why are you running these numbers? That's the CFO's job." I didn't flinch. I leaned forward just enough to make her look at me. "Monroe asked me to review them." I lied smoothly. "He's worried about the buyout options on the pension fund." She studied me for a moment, her eyes narrowing as if she was seeing me for the first time. Then she nodded. "Fine. Keep me updated." And just like that, I was no longer the secretary. I was the man with the numbers. The man with the paperclip that could hold the whole company together, or pull it apart. The pension plan was my way in. I'd studied it like a holy text. Every clause, every footnote, every discretionary line item that gave the administrator, me, authority. Monroe never bothered with the details. He wanted results. And that's what I gave him. I restructured benefits, streamlined payments. I found efficiencies that freed up capital, enough to fund Monroe's pet projects and mine, all while building my own leverage. Because every time I changed a clause, I documented it. Every time I found a loophole, I noted who signed off on it. And every time someone questioned my authority, I'd smile and show them the signed form, the policy manual, the paperclip that held it all together. Monroe didn't see it coming. He was aging out, and the board wanted fresh leadership. He'd spent so long ignoring me, so long laughing at my small tasks, that he didn't realize the paperclip in my hand had turned into a lever big enough to move his world. When I sat across from him in the boardroom, Nora at my side, the CFO blinking at the documents I'd prepared, I saw the moment he understood. His eyes flickered from the contracts to my face, the lines deepening around his mouth as he tried to piece it together. "You," he said, voice flat. "You're behind this." I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just placed the final contract in front of him, the one that offered him a graceful exit, generous on paper, but with terms that tied him up tighter than any rope. "The board wants stability," I said. "They want equity. They want silence." I tapped the pin beside the signature line. "They want me." His hand trembled as he signed. The pen felt heavy in his grasp. I watched the ink dry, each letter sealing my place at the top. And when he finished, he looked up at me with a mix of anger and disbelief. "How?" he asked. "How did you?" I leaned back, my voice calm. "Staplers, Monroe," I said. "Paperclips. Memos. Every little thing you thought didn't matter, that's where it started." He shook his head, like he still couldn't believe it. "You were just a secretary." I let that hang in the air, the final echo of his arrogance. "No," I said. "I was the man who ran the system you ignored. The man who learned where every lever was. The man who knew exactly when to pull it." The boardroom was silent. Nora looked at me with a quiet respect. She'd seen it coming, maybe not all of it, but enough to know I wasn't the man they thought I was. The CFO stared at the table, his fingers drumming nervously. He'd voted for me because he'd seen the numbers, seen the efficiencies I'd created. They were real. But the real victory was in the details, the paperclips, the pension clauses, the quiet conversations that shaped their choices. I'd built this empire one document at a time, one signature at a time, and now I was the man signing the checks. There was no applause, no red carpet, just the sound of the boardroom clock ticking, the faint hum of the AC. I stood, adjusting my tie, the badge clipped to my jacket reading, CEO, Silas Carter. It felt right, like a suit I'd been tailoring in secret for years. Monroe stood slowly, his face pale, and extended his hand. "Congratulations," he said, his voice a whisper. I shook his hand, firm but not gloating. "Thank you," I said. "I'll take it from here." And as he walked out, the door clicking shut behind him, I looked around the room and saw the future I'd built. A future where every detail mattered. A future where no one would ever underestimate the man with the paperclip again. Because control doesn't start with the big gestures. It starts in the margins, in the unnoticed corners, in the smallest tools. A paperclip in the right hands is the key to an empire. And I had the right hands. Brielle came back into my office the day after Monroe signed over his shares, the same office where she'd once dropped off my lunch with a sigh and a reminder not to work too late. This time she walked in wearing a tight smile and a pale gray dress that looked like it had been picked for a funeral. Mine, presumably. She carried a designer handbag that probably cost more than my first car and perched herself on the edge of the guest chair, crossing her legs like she was about to start negotiations. "Let's keep this civil," she began, smoothing a crease in her dress. "You're doing well now, right? So let's talk settlement." Settlement. That word landed like a punch, but I didn't flinch. I'd been preparing for this moment longer than she knew. I let her talk, the words tumbling out like carefully rehearsed lines in a play. She wanted an amicable split, she said, half of everything, plus spousal support, plus a chunk of my shares to compensate for the emotional distress I'd caused her. Emotional distress, she'd worn that like a badge every time she belittled me in front of her friends, every time she'd called me her starter husband. She thought she was being gracious, offering me the chance to sign away my life with a polite smile. But I wasn't the man she thought she married. Not anymore. "Of course," I said calmly, reaching for the envelope I'd prepared. "I believe in fairness, too." I slid the envelope across the desk. It was thick, filled with documents, pages and pages that documented every transfer she'd made using my company's money. Every time she'd funneled funds from Carter and Layton's accounts into her wellness app, every time she'd signed invoices with my name, every time she'd dipped into the pension system she thought I'd set up just for her. Her face faltered as she picked it up, the color draining from her cheeks. She flipped through the pages, faster at first, then slower as the words blurred and the signatures, hers, jumped off the page. "Silas," she whispered, her voice tight. What is all this?" I leaned back, my voice steady. "That's the record of every asset you transferred under false pretenses," I said. "Every dollar you took from my company and claimed was yours. Every client you reached out to using my contacts. Every time you profited from a relationship you didn't build." Her lips parted as she tried to find a defense, but the words caught in her throat. I didn't know," she said. "I thought." "You thought," I cut in, my tone sharp enough to slice through her excuses, "that I wasn't paying attention. You thought you could build your empire on my back and then walk away with half of mine." She set the envelope down, her hands trembling. "Silas, please," she said, her voice cracking now. "I didn't mean to." "Didn't mean to what?" I asked. "Didn't mean to defraud my company? Didn't mean to sabotage my reputation? Didn't mean to make me the punchline at your dinner parties?" I stood then, slow and deliberate, the way I'd seen Monroe do it when he wanted to fill the room with his presence. "You see, Brielle," I said, "you played this game with the assumption that I'd always be the man behind the desk, the man who made your life easier. But I built something while you were laughing. I built something you can't touch." She opened her mouth to argue, but I held up a hand, silencing her. "You wanted a settlement," I continued, my voice calm. "Here it is." I pulled a single piece of paper from the folder, a settlement offer. It was short, simple, a single dollar. She stared at it like it was a grenade. "What is this?" she whispered. "It's what you get," I said. $1. And consider yourself lucky I'm not pressing charges. Because everything you did is documented. And every account you thought you'd siphoned from is already flagged by the compliance team. You leave with what you brought into this marriage, $1 and a name you can tarnish on your own time." Tears welled in her eyes, but I didn't look away. I'd seen those tears before, at parties when someone else got the compliment she thought she deserved, in the bathroom mirror when she rehearsed her lines. They weren't real. Not now. Not ever. She reached out as if to touch my hand, but I pulled it back, leaving her reaching into empty space. "Silas, please," she pleaded. "Don't do this. I'm sorry. I didn't know you knew," I said. "You just didn't care. You thought I'd always be the man who said yes. But that man's gone. And the man who stands here now? He doesn't owe you a damn thing." I gestured toward the door. "Your car's out front," I said. "Registered to the LLC you dissolved last week. I had the tow truck pick it up this morning. You'll find it in the visitor's lot, keys in the ignition. Consider it your exit package." She looked at me like I'd struck her. "My car," she said, voice trembling. "Silas, that's my—" "No," I said, my tone final. "That's my car. Bought with my money. Registered under my name through the company's asset protection plan. You're not the owner anymore. And the app you were so proud of? The one you started with my resources? I own that too. You can keep the $1. That's my gift to you." A bow on the package. She rose slowly, her hand shaking, the folder clutched to her chest like a shield. Her eyes met mine, red-rimmed and unsteady. "I never thought you'd do this," she whispered. "I never thought you'd." I let a small smile slip onto my face, the same smile I'd worn the day Monroe called me just a secretary. "That's the problem," I said. "You never thought." I watched her walk to the door, her step slow, her shoulders slumped. I didn't call after her. I didn't wish her luck. I just stood there, letting the silence fill the room. When the door clicked shut, I exhaled. The weight of 1,000 nights spent in the shadows lifted from my chest. I looked around the office, the polished wood desk, the framed photos of a life she'd never cared to know, and I felt the satisfaction settle deep in my bones. I'd given her. Royce thought he was untouchable. Brielle always treated him like the golden boy, the one who'd make everything right if her plans with me fell through. He'd swagger into every family dinner, slapping me on the back like I was some harmless uncle, telling jokes at my expense while she laughed too loud, like I wasn't even there. "Bro," he'd say, leaning in with that fake concern, "you really need to man up if you're gonna keep her happy." I'd smile and nod, playing the part, while I made mental notes about every company invoice he'd accidentally had me sign. See, Royce was on our internal payroll too, listed under a fabricated role, Wellness Outreach Liaison, a fancy title Brielle invented so he could collect a salary without doing any actual work. He'd brag about the extra cash he was making, always in that lazy tone, like it was his birthright. He didn't know that every time he bragged, every time he winked at me like I was the secretary cleaning up his mess, I was adding another line to his file. Because while he was busy playing the big shot, I was busy playing the long game. I watched the payroll system like a hawk, every bonus and expense report that came across my desk. Royce's name showed up every month, a neat line on the ledger. A few hundred here for outreach, a few thousand there for project consulting. Every time, signed off by Brielle, who thought she was above scrutiny. But the system was mine now. Every signature went through me, every dollar traced back to the same fraudulent paperwork that gave her the pension payout she didn't deserve. They both thought I'd never notice. They both thought I was still the man who'd smile and fetch coffee. The morning Royce's badge failed at the office was one I'd waited for. I'd orchestrated it with Nora, who'd become more of an ally than Brielle or Royce could ever guess. "We've got a redundancy," I'd told her, showing her the documents that proved Royce's role was nothing but a shell. She'd agreed to terminate the position quietly, letting the system handle the rest. When Royce walked in that morning, badge in hand, the scanner beeped red and buzzed with finality. The look on his face was priceless. Like a man who'd bet the house on a rigged game and just found out who'd been dealing the cards. I watched from my office, coffee in hand, as he waved at the guard and demanded to be let in. "This is a mistake," he shouted, his voice rising, panic creeping into his tone. "Get Silas. He knows who I am." I took a slow sip, savoring the moment. I didn't know who he was. I knew every piece of him, his fake role, his fake work, his real fraud. I'd seen every paycheck, every comped expense that he'd filed for spa days and dinners that had nothing to do with wellness. I'd watched Brielle sign them all, oblivious to the fact that the secretary was building a case against them both. When the guard called me, his voice hesitant, I kept my tone even. "Tell Mr. Royce's services are no longer required," I said. "His badge has been deactivated, and his position has been dissolved." A pause. "If he has any questions, he can contact HR." I hung up before the guard could respond. Royce had no questions that HR could answer. Everything he wanted to know was in that ledger I'd kept, the one that detailed every transaction, every false signature. He was just another line on a page now, another footnote in the empire I'd built. As he stormed out, shouting into his phone, probably to Brielle, who'd have no answers, I watched the panic spread across his face. The arrogance drained away, leaving nothing but a man who'd built his castle on someone else's land. He'd never understood that ambition wasn't about shouting the loudest. It was about patience, precision, and knowing when to strike. I'd spent years letting him think I was the secretary, letting him think I'd always be the man behind the desk. But the man who built Carter and Leighton Capital wasn't the secretary anymore. He was the one who owned the ledger, the one who controlled the locks, the one who held the keys. And Royce? He was just another man who'd underestimated the power of quiet ambition. That day, as he left the building, his badge useless, his swagger gone, I felt the weight of every small humiliation he'd thrown at me fall away. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to gloat. I'd already won. The system I'd built made sure of that. The look on his face was the only victory lap I needed. I now run Carter and Leighton Capital. From secretary to CEO. From the man they called lucky to the man they now whisper about in boardrooms and spa clubs. Every time I walk into a room, I see their eyes flick to me with that mixture of fear and curiosity. The same ones who laughed behind my back now straighten their ties and choose their words carefully. They remember the spa club, how Brielle called me just a secretary and found out, in front of everyone, that she'd been living in my shadow all along. They still whisper about that moment, about the glass slipping from her hand, the way her voice cracked when Monroe said the words. They whisper about the way I sat there, calm, like I'd planned every second. And maybe I had. I'd learned from every document, every conversation, every smirk they'd thrown my way. I'd studied ambition like it was a language only the overlooked spoke fluently. I signed checks now. I hire and fire. The pension plan, my pension plan, runs smoothly, funding my expansions, my investments. Every time someone calls me lucky, I smile, but inside, I remember every late night in the study, every quiet moment when I was the man behind the desk. Luck had nothing to do with it. It was the grind, the patience. The ledger I built one paperclip at a time. Brielle calls sometimes, leaving voicemails with that forced cheerfulness she used to reserve for dinner parties. She talks about starting over, about finding herself. I listen and then delete them. Because the man she married is gone. The man who fetched coffee, who flinched when she belittled him, who stayed quiet when she called him Seifa. He's a footnote in the story I'm writing now. Sometimes, I walk through the old hallways where I used to carry memos and coffee cups, and I see the new assistants, the ones who think they're invisible. I make sure to greet them, to ask about their day. Because I know what it's like to be overlooked. I know what it's like to be underestimated. And I know that the next me could be in their shoes, quiet, patient, building a fortress from every smile, every sigh, every paperclip they're handed. Because that's how you go from lucky to legendary. You don't raise your voice. You raise your value. And when they finally see what you've become, when they see the name on the building, on the pension plan, on the checks, they'll whisper. They'll wonder. And they'll never see it coming. That's the real reward, not the applause, not the headlines, but the knowledge that I built it all with their doubts as my foundation. I close the ledger now and lock it away. It's done its job. The man behind the desk is the man at the head of the table now. And when the next challenge comes, and it always does, I'll be ready. Not lucky, not safe, but legendary. Because the real power? It's never in the spotlight. It's in the quiet moments when no one's watching. When you're alone with the numbers and the doubts and the steady hum of ambition that never quite lets you rest. That's where you build your empire. That's where you learn to smile when they underestimate you. And that's when you sign the checks.